Hey, before we get started, I want to remind you that Truce is listener supported. If you want to be a part of this one-of-a-kind show that asks big questions in an approachable way, become a patron. For just $5 a month, you can help me tell big stories like this upcoming season on the history of fundamentalism. And you'll get access to bonus materials. That's all at patreon.com/trucepodcast. That's patreon.com/trucepodcast. This episode is part of a long series about the history of Christian fundamentalism. It will make a lot more sense if you go back and start at the beginning of Season 5. Oh, man. How's everybody doing? Okay, this is the Truce Podcast. I'm Chris Starin. We'll just wait a few more minutes before we get going. And the sound you're hearing is from a video chat I did last week with patrons of this show. And then I've seen some mixed reviews about In His Steps across the different platforms. Because over the last few weeks, I've been releasing the audiobook version of In His Steps, this massively successful book from the late 1800s. We've been talking on the show about the history of fundamentalism, and fundamentalism was a reaction to this movement called the social gospel, a movement that is perfectly encapsulated in this fictional story. It was a big nebulous thing, but basically it emphasized doing good works and de-emphasized or even omitted the need for salvation through Jesus. It was a kind of liberal theology, and liberal theologies in the late 1800s and early 1900s were sweeping through seminaries, popular pulpits, and books like In His Steps. Rather than just, do an episode about the book on the show, I thought we would read it together. You can find it on the feed just before this episode. That way we could get a feel for the social gospel for ourselves, and then discuss it. Patrons of the show were invited to join, and today I'm going to play the highlights from our talk. Now, if you want to hear the whole thing, all 1.5 hours of it, you can sign up and become a patron yourself at patreon.com/trucepodcast. But today, I want to play my favorite parts for you right here. Did everybody read or listen to the whole thing?
Yes.
Yes.
That sounds pretty confident for most everybody.
Well, I listened to part of it. I'll be honest, I had to skim a bunch of it because I don't know what everybody else thought. I didn't like that book at all.
Oh, really?
That
was going to be my first question is what did you think? Andy, what didn't you like about the book?
I thought it was heavy-handed. I read a lot. I rarely read Christian fiction because it's the same story every time. A bad person comes to Christ and never does bad again. They become this overflowing fount of goodness flowing through the world until they get hit by a bottle from the top of the window, or in this case.
Yeah.
And I just have so much trouble with that idea.
Anybody else? I actually enjoy the book, so I'll go on record as saying that. Does anybody else have thoughts?
I read a lot. During the pandemic, I spent a lot of time in different sources, you being one of them, in American history during the Gilded Age. And I was surprised because I expected, because it's a period piece, it's 130 odd years old, right? And yeah, I agree with Andy that it sounds like something written 130 years ago also, right? What I didn't expect was to hear things in it that once some of them made a commitment and said yes, like real Christianity is, like real kingdom of God stuff is you don't know exactly what you're really, really, really saying yes to in the end.
Yeah.
And that was the way their stories kind of carried through, really, and that they had to confront some things about themselves and their relationships with each other too. And the way that related to not only those that were in their own households, but people that they were in their own congregation, where they actually developed relationships with each other that looked kind of like, in my mind, the way that fellowship literally should look like.
Yeah. In what way?
just sharing completely openly what's going on in my mind about my commitment. We don't really talk that way to each other very often, very rarely do we anyway, right? Confessional. It was very confessional in the way that they talked. And there was no angle on making you agree with me about where I was going with my decision. And I didn't judge you if you disagreed with me and decided you wanted to do a different way or course of action in your life. And but also accountability at the same time. It was a very non-judgmental accountability. I thought, how does that happen? It's such an anomaly in Christianity to have a fellowship within a small body that you're associating with all the time at a high level, to have that kind of a relationship with each other to where you can just, man, I need to tell you what I got on my mind. I don't know. It just kind of surprised me that there was some elements in there that I wasn't expecting to see, because it wasn't all smelling good. It wasn't ending all neatly packaged necessarily. There was broken relationships. There were failures. There was death.
I will say there was at least one moment of judgmentalism where one of the ladies confronts Jasper Chase about his lackadaisical lifestyle, just being a playboy. And that eventually spurs him onto bettering his life and seeking some kind of higher purpose. Yeah. But that's the one moment I can think of where at least there was somebody called out for his actions. Well, Rachel, what did you think of the book?
I loved it. I was surprised at how relevant it was, not to use a buzzword, but, it was interesting for me because I grew up reading Arch comics. And so, books, basically all of the best, selling Christian books of like the previous 100 years had been made into Arch comics. And so I had only read the In His Steps Arch comic, which of course they had moved it forward into like, the countercultural, like hippie movement of the 70s or whatever. And you really could take the story and move it into, like Bruce said, it's very set in its, Gilded Age, kind of Victorian, wealthy setting, but you could move the story, I think, into any setting, which has got to be why it's sold 50 million copies, is what I read, and, translated in so many languages. So in a lot of ways, I felt like it was timeless. And I thought it was very clever. I have a lot of the same complaints about Christian fiction and Christian movies that other people have. But I think that what he was doing in 1896, is that correct?
And I can't remember the exact year, but it ended in the 1800s.
Was a relatively new idea at the time, to take propositions that you want to teach people and put them into a story form. It's almost like what Lee Strobel did with Case for Christ, only, decades sooner, where you blend the two together and say, these are the principles I'm trying to teach you, but this is what it could look like in people's lives. And I loved that part about it. And I could see why it would draw people in, especially if they were used to a very, kind of dry, but is didactic kind of preaching, to have somebody, tell stories in this way. Because I understand he initially presented this as a sermon series from the pulpit, which was very clever, because everybody you're going to come back every week to hear the next installment. It was basically a serial, from the pulpit. And I thought that was clever. And I loved what Bruce was saying about the non-judgmental accountability. I think that was really interesting, that they were all going to follow the same principles, and they were going to hold each other accountable to follow the principles. But there was room for individual conscience and how it would apply. I loved it.
I think it's interesting coming from a Christian podcaster, and having made Christian films and also written Christian novels, to be in that genre and have everybody to know it's kind of a hated genre. It's easy to bash. It's much harder when you've done it. Because I think one of the tough things Charles Sheldon had to face is writing a book that is going to be popular for the masses
Yes.
versus one that's going to be popular for a certain niche or group. And that's tough. By having this sort of simplistic language, simplistic characters and things, it kind of opens it up to a larger audience in a lot of ways. So it's hard for me to criticize that. And also, of course, it is somewhat dated, being that it's over 100 years old. But I can see why he would have done what he did, especially, being that he was not a professional writer by trade. He was a minister at this point. And in some ways, it reminded me of Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian. And wrote a very sort of stripped down version of a story. He barely describes his characters, barely describes the settings, but tells a fantastic story. And in that way, kind of strips out all the filigree. And I'm not going to say that he's as good, like Charles Sheldon is as good a writer as Andy Weir is, but they kind of reminded me of each other because of that sort of simplicity and mass market appeal. Where have you seen WWJD in your life? Because I know I grew up listening to fundamentalist radio, but my church was not a fundamentalist church. And we would go to conferences and we saw it on T-shirts and on bracelets and things. How have you seen it throughout your life?
I mean, I've seen it on bracelets and T-shirts and bumper stickers. I mean, just it's everywhere. I'm trying to think of some of the plays I've seen done on it that was fairly humorous too. Yeah.
Because what was interesting to me, this book is sort of in story form. It is the social gospel, which was a liberal form of theology, which we'll get into here. And also there'll be more episodes about. But I was going to conferences that were much more conservative and seeing WWJD there. Kind of interesting to me in researching this, that the attitude towards that phrase was totally fine when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s. Everybody was fine with it. And I never knew that this was part of a sort of a more liberal movement until I started researching for this season. I was like, what? Why was that catchphrase everywhere? But I think it's easy to read it and not even notice that this would be a liberal theology. Is that what you all took away?
Yeah, I think so. I didn't grow up in church, but my church, my Christian life and history is that of a pretty conservative background. And I was raising kids when the WWJD thing was going on, and stuff. And what I thought was interesting was that once they said, what would Jesus do in every department of your life and all your decisions during the day? What would Jesus do? That it didn't take them long to realize that their decisions were going to impact other people. And if it wasn't that in the immediate, it became that eventually. That wasn't the way I saw it in the 80s and 90s being played out.
WWJD got repurposed for individualistic Christianity.
Right.
And I don't think that's what was really in my interpretation and observation from where I sat in a very conservative construct. That I think that's not what was happening.
The one thing that I think was different about this, as opposed to those of us who, grew up in, maybe a conservative evangelical all the way to fundamentalist background, was the holiness movement that a lot of us experienced to some degree or another was about personal holiness. And so that really, I think, lends itself to the I am more a better religious person than you are. But in this context, all of the decisions were being made based on how they perceived that it was going to affect society. And how, what is the prize fighting, which, I imagine would look a whole lot different than what we would see as, a boxing match today and what was going on surrounding it. And, the saloon and what that represented. Everything was being decided not like, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't chew, I don't go with girls who do. And, I don't go to movies and I don't do this and I do that. It was all about what are the impact of my actions upon society. And so I think that might guard it some against, that I'm holier than you.
One of the other critiques that goes along with this book is that they rarely ever talk about scripture to say, okay, what did Jesus do in a similar situation? It was usually, like I might pray about it, but that's about all. I'm not going to consult scripture. So it's one of the critiques that people have about this book. They rarely look to see what Jesus did, but ask themselves, what would Jesus do in my situation? Which is kind of an interesting thing. I would have liked to have seen maybe that play out a little bit more. But you're right. Yeah, there was rarely any disagreement when somebody landed on something, at least from somebody who had also taken the pledge. And as Rachel mentioned, there was a reason I did the holiness episode right before this, because you see that holiness movement. There really was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this emphasis on personal holiness and trying to see, can I live a holier life? And that had a lot of really strange different branches that came off of it. But it's a good impulse when you read scripture to try to live a holier life. With that in mind, how do you see the social gospel inside of this book? Because this book kind of represents that movement. How do you see the social gospel as we've talked about it so far this season?
So in a sense, the book does emphasize social action, maybe more so than evangelism, but there is evangelism taking place. There's, revival meetings are these evangelistic tent meetings are a backdrop of the story. And
can I play devil's advocate really quick?
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever hear them actually say the gospel in the tent?
No. and it's hard to know if people were so Christianized that a lot of this was presumed, right? That everybody had read the Gospels, knew the life of Christ, knew this stuff. But it felt like to me they were still being called to respond. I'm not sure that it was one to the exclusion of the other.
Yeah.
I think the limited knowledge that I have, Chris, is that this split happened later. So that we may be reading back into this story, the idea of a split between evangelism and social action, because this is something that took place, decades, at least a few decades later.
The main split, we'll get into this in a future
1920s?
episode that comes out after this, was just before World War I and into World War I as well. So it was just coming up into that. But I was really careful as I was reading it that I was looking for any kind of actual evangelism, because one of the hallmarks of the social gospel is that it generally lifts up social action and downplays evangelism. And you do see people sort of come to God, but you never see how they do that, if there's a process, any of that kind of stuff. Or are they just sort of committing to this? What would Jesus do? We don't really know. And I think as a content creator myself, having made movies and books and stuff like that, there's always this big discussion of how clear do I have to make the gospel for this to be a Christian project, or for people to understand what I'm talking about. So if you go on YouTube and find my film Between the Walls, skip to the end, and they have the longest gospel conversation you can imagine. Because as like a 22-year-old writing this script, I was like really afraid I was going to miss a point. And then when you get to our second film, Bringing Out Bobby, we condensed that a whole lot because we were like, we don't have to cover every single point. But it gets into a big discussion of how much do you have to have the gospel in there, and also what were Charles Sheldon's, what were his motivations in not having a step-by-step, this is how you come to Jesus moment. But one of the reasons that this book is so present in social gospel conversations about the history of that is that there isn't really a come to Jesus prescription within it, how you do it. But at the same time, you have that social action thing. So when it gets to future episodes, we'll talk about Walter Rauschenbusch, who was the main thinker of the social gospel and wrote a very popular book about it that I go through in the episode. He's very clear that righteous living is all that God demands. That's a paraphrase of what he says. It isn't about a coming to Jesus moment or a relationship with God necessarily. It is doing great works socially, and not about individual transformation, but about social transformation. And that would at least become the social gospel. And of course, there were a lot of different flavors of social gospel, so it's hard to put these things in a box. But one of the things you see in his steps is people concerned about society and how their actions impact society, but not necessarily about sin, unless it comes to things that are like vices that could hurt somebody, like alcohol. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It's a very helpful book, I think, for Christians, very convicting, regardless of what your stances are, what your beliefs are. But it does get into some sticky territory because it does not really talk about the relationship between a person and God.
Do you think it makes a difference that this was initially a sermon series presented by a minister? So maybe. He's approaching it as, okay, you understand the gospel, you've made a decision, but I don't see it affecting, your life. So I'm trying to, take you guys to the next level. I'm trying to challenge you.
Possibly. Yeah. So, but that of course is, I don't know. I wasn't there, right. But, and I haven't read anything that says either way. But that is what the social gospel would sort of become, would be to downplay evangelism and to lift up things like Walter Rauschenbusch, when he's writing, eventually leads to socialism. He's a socialist and starts to kind of push that. And he's one of the guys that ties liberal theology and socialism together. And so then there's this big pushback right before World War I and into World War I to say, if those guys, liberal theology is all about helping people, then we in conservative theology don't want to be associated with that. So we're going to pull back from our social engagement, at least in public, in a move that's called The Great Reversal, which there will be an episode about. So.
That's going to be good.
Yeah. Bruce?
So when I was young and growing, and the first times I heard the term social gospel referenced, it was a negative term. And now, over the past years and years, I think, well, why was and still is this thing they call the social gospel anathema? Why is it the enemy? Why is it, demonized? In this day and age, in this context, it's like, well, these social justice warriors. And I go, what, isn't that actually what God is into?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if we think there's a problem somehow with social justice, for instance, that for some reason there's something going on that's wrong with it, then shouldn't the Christian community be the first people to concern themselves with righting the boat?
Yeah. I think in some ways we're all looking for a litmus test to understand very quickly where somebody else is. So it's like, if they say this buzzword, I can put them into this bucket. And sometimes that's one of those things. It's like a natural human thing. We have to put people into buckets so we understand how to deal with them. But partially it's also this thing of almost like gang warfare, where if the other gang wears blue and that's their color, I can't wear blue because that signals that I'm with them and I'm not with them. So what happens coming up into the mid 19 teens, religious conservatives saw what was going on in with the social gospel and said, I don't want to be associated with them because they're leading people away in seminaries and in big popular churches and in popular books and stuff like that. So to keep my people from being poisoned by this thing, we need to create a separate environment. And so some of it is self-preservation, but unfortunately it morphs into this thing where suddenly you're right. We have these buzzwords that we can just bash somebody. Oh, they're a social warrior. And now I don't have to pay attention to them or their cause or any of those other things. But yeah, you can see that this is kind of where it started. And then there are guys like Walter Rauschenbusch again, who we'll get to, who literally did tie this stuff to socialism. And then coming up into, 1917 with the Russian Revolution, that was a real threat. So part of the problem was they had these gigantic, credible threats, real threats. So they were trying to create a sort of a shortcut language so that they could identify what was a threat and what wasn't. And I think we all do that. But unfortunately, like the problem is that we are commanded as Christians to do the whole of the law is encapsulated in love the Lord and love your neighbor. But we're generally, like I've said in the season, very good at one or the other, but terrible at both. That's one of the goals of the season. I'll keep bringing that idea up because we often, like I had some conversations with some folks on a trail I was hiking recently, and they were talking about their theologically liberal friends who basically disregard large chunks of the Bible because it disagrees with their lifestyle. And I was like, well, but God tells us that if we love him, we will obey his commands. And that's the loving God part. But they were very focused on, my friends were very focused on loving your neighbor. And that the hard part is we have to marry those two things. We have to be able to say, I need to obey God and love my neighbor. But we tend to focus on one or the other, unfortunately. Okay, time for a little bit of a break. We'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by No Small Endeavor, the acclaimed podcast from Great Feeling Studios and PRX. In each episode, host and award-winning theologian Lee C. Camp sits down with courageous and impassioned people, like Hollywood legend Rob Reiner and civil rights hero Reverend James Lawson, talking about what it means to find true happiness and flourish in day-to-day life. And if you're looking for somewhere to start, why not check out the recent episode with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Tim Alberta on Christian nationalism's role in the Republican Party. Follow No Small Endeavor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global media organization that makes the life-changing wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to all. As a part of that mission, Where You're From is a podcast for those who believe it's important to stop and listen before we speak. Join us on each episode as we ask another Christian thought leader where you're from and discover how their life experiences and expertise, even if we may disagree with something they say, offers us important perspectives worth thinking about. To see our list of guests, visit whereyou'refrom.org today. That's whereyafrom.org. I'm Russell Berry, reminding you that it's not just about where you're at, but it's also about where you're from.
Welcome back. We continued the conversation with an observation by Dwayne, essentially that he thought the book was patronizing in that it was full of rich people telling poor people at the rectangle what to do. His audio was pretty rough, so we'll skip to our responses. I was really struck by that as well, because even in some of the writings about the book that I've read, they talk about this book as appealing to the middle class, and yet there's really not much in the way of middle class representation in the book. It's basically very wealthy people or the very, very poor people. And the very poor people aren't main characters. It's mostly what can the ultra wealthy do to help the very poor, which is an angle. I mean, it's not, not saying you can't do that in a book.
Back to Andy's reference of the Gilded Age, there really wasn't much middle class then, right? And that was part of the problem, was these huge divisions in society.
And it's interesting with the alcohol stuff, because this was a big era of social change and social involvement, where Christians were on the forefront. I've had some episodes of Truce about how Christians were on the forefront of prohibition and also women's rights, which went hand in hand in that era. What were some of the social movements that these guys started? What were some of the things that you noticed, other movements that were going on other than just the prohibition movement?
Union labor.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
It wasn't talked about a lot, but it was there.
Mm-hmm.
It was mentioned a few times, even just in passing, just a passing comment, like so-and-so had just come from some meeting where they were talking about these laborers that were striking.
Okay. I was just going to say, I agree with the union thing. I saw that, and the trying to get on the city council or city board, whatever that was. They're like, we as Christians need to take this seriously, and our actions need to have impact, not just in our own lives, like we talked about earlier, but in society as well. We need to make this a better world, and being involved in the decision making on the city council would be helpful for that. And yeah, taking care of people's needs, workers' needs, that would definitely help. So you definitely saw that aspect of it. I agree.
What about the Pure Food movement? Did anybody see that?
Yeah, that was
covered
what stood out to me, Chris, because I had just previous to this finished listening to an audiobook called The Secret History of Home Economics, which is actually a way more interesting book than it sounds like. And that it totally tied in. And because there was a brand new discipline that had been founded in the late 1800s, which was originally called domestic science. And that just feeds right into what Felicia's doing. And again, people think of like home economics as being kind of this conservative, keep women in their place. But like so many things, it was actually domestic science was part of the progressive movement, applying this new knowledge to women's lives and to make the homes, safer and empower people. And it was started by a woman named Ellen Swallow Richards, who was the first woman to graduate with a chemistry degree from MIT. And she's the mother of domestic science. And so what Felicia is talking about doing there at the settlement house is brand new cutting edge stuff, talking about pure food and, nutrition demonstrations. And I don't know if we're going to get into the part about women's roles, but
We probably should, yeah. But I like the Pure Food movement thing. They barely touch on it in the book, but this was an era where you could expect, if you're getting bread, there might be things like sawdust in there, or there might formaldehyde in your milk. So as much as we make fun of, and this was in the book, Rachel, as much as we make fun of white bread in this country, and like Wonder Bread was kind of a revelation in its time because it was guaranteed not to have any of that stuff in there. And it was white, so you could see any kind of stuff that was hidden inside of it. So it's not healthy bread. We all know that now. It's not great for you, but at least it didn't have sawdust in it. And
that was how domestic science was born. Ellen Swallow Richards, again, the first woman to study chemistry at MIT, would take these foods and analyze them. And she would find, ground up mahogany inside cinnamon and just all kinds of adulterants. And there was no FDA, there was no regulation of any of this. And she would study water, and she would study harmful things on the back of wallpaper. And, it was all about bringing safety to the home and empowering women and teaching them, how to protect their families. And it was about women's empowerment.
Yeah, it's a fascinating movement. I kind of wish they'd spend more time on it in the book. It would have been a total distraction, but it's a fascinating moment. But to curve back around to what Rachel was saying, how do you think women were portrayed in the book? And do you think maybe it would have been received differently then in the 1800s than it is now? Because I know there were some comments. Some of the people who listened to the book for me, I had 3 volunteers listen to it before I released it, so we could look for any kind of mistakes I may have made. And some of them said, oh, you should buffer this with a little bit of a warning that women are not 3-dimensional characters in this book. And I was like, I think I kind of want people to go into it blind and just let it wash over them. So what did you think? How were women portrayed in the book?
So, Chris, I loved the way that the women
were portrayed
in the book. And again, putting it in its 1896 context, like you said, this is a Victorian era novel. These are high society, privileged, Gilded Age women living, a very sheltered Victorian lifestyle where they are expected to fulfill their obligations to society and do what their parents want. And repeatedly, the book portrays young, unmarried females making their own decisions, going against class expectations and doing what they feel is right, even if it's going to upset everyone around them. And again, because of that tie-in with domestic science, which I've been learning about, I loved that part where Felicia goes to the minister and the bishop and says, I want to, start these programs at the settlement house. And they basically say, we don't know anything about it and we don't know if it's going to work, but if you think you're supposed to do it, then we'll support you. And I think for the context, that was very powerful to have these two important, middle-aged men, religious authorities speak to a young, unmarried female and say, you lead, you do it. If you want to do it, we'll support it. And I think the sentence that I wrote down was that about the book was young women's independent action was characterized as Christian discipleship. Not that they were being rebellious, not that they were being, unfeminine, not that they were being manly or inappropriate, or it was characterized as Christian discipleship. And for the context, what I felt like he was portraying was women's liberation. But it's not just liberation from societal expectations. It was liberation to something. They were liberated to follow Christ according to their own conscience. And this minister is willing to support them if they are seeking to follow Christ. And I just love that. And I thought for a book written in 1896, that was revolutionary. And it had to be a powerful message. There had to be young women who read that and thought, okay, I can follow Christ.
Do you think this book is premillennialist or postmillennialist or none of the above? Since I've spent so much time in this season talking about premillennialism.
Definitely postmillennialist. Yeah.
What makes you say that?
Because they're anticipating an upward trajectory that sadly we know wasn't going to happen. They're probably soon after this is the founding of the magazine Christian Century, which we now think of as a mainline liberal magazine. But that was named that because they believed that the 20th century would be the Christian century. And then, and I know we'll learn more about, that World War I and, seeing the horrors of humanity. So yeah, they definitely thought that there was going to be an upward trajectory, which in that way, it's a little bit, there's some sadness that you feel there because we know that there is going to be a lot of progress in terms of making, a more just society, but also that it's not necessarily headed in the steady upward arc that they're believing for. But I also think about how Mother Teresa famously said, we are not called to be successful, we are called to be faithful. And I think that was another theme that comes up in the book, is that it doesn't matter if the newspaper is making less money or whatever, we're called to be faithful. So we're supposed to have, an even irrational optimism and hope, no matter what's going on around us, because that's what it means to follow Christ.
Yeah, I have to do the right thing, even if it's not going to change anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really hard to do. What do you think? Is this a book you would recommend to other people? Is this one you're glad you read? What are your thoughts? I noticed that Rachel gave thumbs up on an audio medium. I love that.
I guess I better say what that is. And, it probably depends on what kind of literature a person likes. If you're fascinated with a certain type of literature, if you would choose, like I would, to listen to other, Victorian literature or whatever, like Andy said, there, it's not necessarily a setting or a style that's going to appeal to everybody. But I would recommend it. I mean, I enjoyed it. It carried me along and was inspiring.
And I would probably not recommend it. I would recommend some other authors that cover some of the same themes, just maybe not as heavy-handedly.
See, I actually have recommended this book to other folks. Partially it is because it is so easy to get the theme of the book. You don't have to dig very far. It's kind of right there on the surface. I found it very convicting. And there's actually another book I'm considering ending the season with as like a bonus at the end that is also a little heavy-handed, but I think sometimes we need that. We need something that's very clear. Again, Andy and I have gone back and forth on some things about journalism. You'll hear it in some of the episodes we have.
I can say it again if you want.
You can, but where he's been sort of not excited about the world of journalism. And I've been trying to say, like, Andy, before you can really comment on the world of journalism, you need to go report any story and then come back and tell me what you've learned. And part of that with Christian media, and maybe it's me deflecting, but I always want to tell people, like, you should really consider writing a Christian story or writing a movie or a book or something like that, and see how hard it is to try to get a point across in any medium without being heavy-handed, because it's actually really difficult. I mean, if you look at just about any popular movie, they generally have no message to them, at least no overt message. And
Yes.
any kind of, if you see a movie that, say, wants to try to encourage you to take care of the environment, inevitably people will walk away saying it was heavy-handed, regardless of what movie it is, anytime there's a message. So you're kind of already fighting an uphill battle and making it a Christian project, because you're trying to convey something about God to them. But in order to do that, you have to kind of verbalize those things, because also the audiences are not particularly great at picking things up, I've noticed over the years. So like I've said previously, on my second film, Bringing Out Bobby, the parents were dead the whole movie. But after screenings, audience members would come up to us and say, it was so sad when the parents died in that car crash. There is no car crash in that movie. I don't know where they got that from, but people just pick stuff up and miss the point altogether. So I want to stand up and defend the heavy hand every now and then, and I think it's okay every now and then, but it does mean it's probably not as sort of highbrow as something that would be more subtle. Hey, this is Chris in narration mode again. That's something worth exploring when it comes to the social gospel, because I said a few times here that the social gospel downplayed evangelism. That isn't totally accurate. It's a different understanding of the purpose of Christianity altogether. Whereas people like D.L. Moody would argue that Christianity is about saving souls through faith in Jesus, the social gospel put forth the idea that Christianity is about making our world better. You wouldn't be too off by oversimplifying it to say that it's a battle between grace and works. Now, I don't think I've done a good job of explaining that yet this season. The social gospel wasn't a threat because it advocated for good works, but because it often ditched salvation altogether. The social gospel created a belief system that talked a lot about Jesus, but required no faith in him. It's the gospel minus salvation. That's why it's a big deal that In His Steps doesn't feature a gospel message, and why it so well articulates the message of the social gospel. Is Christianity a faith of doing nice things, or is it about a relationship with Jesus? For some reason, we struggle to do both. It doesn't make any sense to me, but we humans always want to prioritize things, and the idea of keeping those two things in tension seems to be a lot for many of us. We either want to get our hands dirty or surrender to Jesus, when we're supposed to do all of it. We like to knock media with an overt Christian message, but then we get into the sticky world of In His Steps. Is it Christian if it doesn't advocate a relationship with Jesus? Maybe that's the topic for another Patreon discussion. But for now, that's it for this edited version of our chat. Hopefully you can see why I wanted to read this book on the feed. It's both convicting and a little controversial. Subscribe to the podcast so you get every new episode as it's released. Also, there is a reason this was for patrons only. I have 2 full-time jobs, like really 2 jobs. This podcast and the job I do in order to pay for the show, which is a ton of work. 11-hour days, often 6 days a week. I could do way more creative stuff and maybe learn how to sleep well at night if I did this show full time. And you can make that happen. Become a patron of the show, like the people you heard from today. You'll gain access to bonus materials and, more importantly, you'll keep good content like this coming for everyone to hear. You can learn how to help at patreon.com/trucepodcast. Only about 2% of the people who listen to Truce ever help out. My goal by the end of the year is to get that to 4%. Just 4% of people who listen. This show is not funded by a company or a grant or a church or a wealthy investor. It's just me doing work between shifts at my full-time job as a school bus driver. So let's send a message that interesting, professional, well-produced Christian media is possible by funding this show in full. Again, that's patreon.com/trucepodcast. You can also send checks or do PayPal through my website or Venmo me at @trucepodcast. Thanks to Dwayne, Andy, Rachel, and Bruce for joining the discussion, and to my brother Nick Starron for helping me suss all this out. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll be back in 2 weeks with more. I'm Chris Starron, and this is Truce. This episode is brought to you by the Compelled Podcast. What would you do if you came face to face with a murderer sent to kill you for being a Christian? For Virginia Prodan, that question isn't hypothetical. Virginia was a small, petite attorney defending Christians in court in communist Romania. And she was really good. So good, in fact, she caught the attention of the communist regime. One day, a tall, muscular man walked into her office, closed the door, and pulled out a gun. He barked, "Shut up, sit down. I'm here to kill you." Virginia was face to face with a trained assassin. What happened next would surprise both of them. Listen to Virginia's entire story on the Compelled Podcast, where they find incredible true life stories of God working through the lives of normal people. Virginia is on episode number 31, which is titled, "He Came to Kill Me." Listen on your podcasting app or at compelledpodcast.com.